Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 11th of August of 2024. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about Kursk direction, where the Ukrainians are trying to continue their offensive operation, but most likely, according to geolocations, according to information we received during the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to stabilize the situation. And when talking about the Kursk direction, today we're going to use different geolocations that were published during the previous 24 hours. We're going to use the Ministry of Defense report of Russian Federation, because during this report we can find lots of very interesting updates and details, and we're going to talk about the analysis of different Western military experts. First, let's talk about the village of Koreniva. From this direction, today the Ukrainians haven't made even a single attempt to attack the city. During the previous few days, the Ukrainians made up to 4 attempts to capture the village, at least the southeastern part, but as for the previous 24 hours, we haven't received even a single update regarding this another attempt to attack. But the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation provided us very interesting updates regarding the situation in this direction. The Russians are saying that over the past 24 hours, as a result of active actions by the Sever group of forces and arrived reserves, army, aviation, and unmanned aerial vehicles and artillery, have thwarted the attempts of Ukrainian forces mobile group on armor to get the depth of the Russian territory near Tolpina, the village of Tolpina, Zhuravli, and Obshikolodez. So just a regular report from the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation, but there is one exception. First of all, the Russians stated that they were attacking the Russian forces in the vicinity of the village by the name of Tolpina. This is the village of Tolpina that is located to the north of Koreniva. The Russians were bombing the Ukrainian forces in the vicinity of the village by the name of Obshikolodez, and the Russians were bombing the Ukrainians in the vicinity of Zhuravli. So let's add some arrows on maps, some lines to understand what the Russians were talking about. So according to the Ministry of Defense report, the Russians were bombing the Ukrainians inside of this triangle. So of course, lots of questions raised right after I read the post, and most likely lots of people had questions: how did it happen, and how is it possible to attack the Ukrainians in this triangle? So once again, the Ministry of Defense reported, and that means that something was happening exactly in this area. But even if we can make a conclusion, and if we trust the Ministry of Defense report, that means that the Ukrainians somehow managed to enter this triangle where they were bombed by the Russians, and after artillery attack, the Ukrainians were forced to fall back to the mainland. So to enter this territory, to enter this triangle, the Ukrainians can do this just using 2 roads. This is the first road. There is a river, as you can see, there is a water barrier, so that's lakes or some water reservoirs and rivers and so on. And to enter this triangle, the Ukrainians could do this just through these 2 territories, these 2 roads. So basically, if we summarize everything, during the previous 24 hours, either the Ukrainians managed to establish complete control over this territory, or at least this territory is no longer under Russian control, and this area is in the gray zone, or can be considered as contested area. And furthermore, to cross the rivers, to cross these lakes, the Ukrainians need to have control over Olgovka, Zhibolovka, Durovka, and Zhuravli. Some of these villages might be captured by the Ukrainians during the previous phases of the Kursk offensive operation. So we haven't received even a single video from this triangle. We haven't received even a single report that can confirm Ukraine control over these territories. But we have 2 videos that were geolocated exactly in this area. This is the first video, and in this video we can see how the Ukrainian forces were moving back from the, let's say, from the triangle, from the direction of the red triangle we've just discussed, towards the mainland. Some of the Ukrainian forces entered the forest trying to hide from Russian artillery forces, and as you can see, the Russians were bombing this territory with multiple launch rocket systems. As a result of this attack, some Ukrainian vehicles were destroyed, some Ukrainian forces were damaged, and of course the Ukrainians increased their speeds towards the mainland. Also, we have another video from the same direction, and this video we can see clearly the Ukrainian forces, 1 tank and 4 carriers, 2 armored vehicles and 2 just light vehicles that were heading obviously also from the area of the Red Triangle towards the mainland, and the Russians were bombing the Ukrainians with Tornado S multiple launch rocket systems, and as a result of this attack, most likely the entire convoy was destroyed. So summarizing everything, we can make the following story. According to the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation, the Ukrainians made another breakthrough, most likely through the village of Olgovka, because during the previous days we got a lot of reports that the village was captured by the Ukrainians. But when the Ukrainians entered this triangle, the Russians start bombing and attacking Ukrainian mobile groups and forced them to fall back, probably causing the Ukrainians significant damage. And when the Ukrainians, those who managed to survive, start moving further back in, let's say, mainland direction, and the first group of Ukrainians were attacked exactly in this point, and those who managed to survive after this strike were damaged and destroyed in the vicinity of Kruglinka. So let's add the retreat, the fallback road. The first attack took place here, and the second attack took place here. Most likely during the next few days, the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation will provide us additional updates regarding the situation. But the most important thing, that this video, this information confirms that most likely the Russians don't have 100% control over these villages. Most likely these villages are under complete Ukraine control, and we can find significant number of infantry, sabotage and reconnaissance group who captured this territory and holding this area before upcoming possible Russian counteroffensives. Now let's move further and let's talk about the western flank of Sudzha direction. During the previous 24 hours, we got two icons from this area. First, we got the fire anomaly that took place in the vicinity of the village by the name of Viktorovka, Gordievka, Внезапная. Most likely the Ukrainians began bombing this territory, and most likely during the next few days the Ukrainians will make an additional attempts to capture this territory and to establish complete control, to raise the flag, to get additional media victory. These villages doesn't mean anything, has no value, let's say, regarding when talking about the Kursk offensive operation. It's just an attempt to make additional videos for TikTok and some different social networks. And we have artillery preparation in the vicinity of the village by the name of Kalinina, and this area is more valuable than the previous one, because the Ukrainians, as you can see, began bombing the rear positions of armored forces of Russian Federation, who are currently located in the village of Tyotkina. This is the village. I'll remind you that during the previous attempts, during the 2024, the Ukrainians made a lot of attempts to capture the village. There were additional operations conducted by the Ukrainians. Most of those attacks were repelled by the Russians. Later, the Russians captured the village of Ryzhevka, and now we see that the Ukrainians are about to begin the next attempt to capture this territory, and most likely they will be able to get some results. So let's wait, because the Ukrainians, the days for Kursk offensive operation for Ukrainians are numbered. They can't doing whatever they like for endless period of time. The Russians are bringing more and more forces, and soon the Ukrainians will not be able to capture even a single square meter. Now let's move to the central direction. The Ukrainian sources published the video how they managed to establish complete control over the village by the name of Sverdlikova. Based on this video, we have adjusted the map and added additional territory under Ukrainian control. Now let's talk about the central and the northern flanks and parts of Sudzha direction. During the previous 24 hours, we got reports that the Russians were bombing the Ukrainian forces in the vicinity of Staraya Sorochna, also according to the report of Ministry of Defense. So which confirms that most likely Malaya Loknya and the Staraya Sorochna, Nikolaevka, these villages are under complete Ukrainian control, or at least in the gray zone. During the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians conducted lots of attempts to move further in direction of the villages by the name of Ivashkovsky, Pravda, Cherkasskaya, Porechna, and then moving through Cherkasskaya, Porechna, the Ukrainians were planning to enter Russian Porechna, Ruskaya Porechna, but as I understand, according to geolocations and the videos we received from this territory, those attacks of armored forces of Ukraine were repelled by the Russians completely. The Ukrainians were destroyed and attacked by the Russian Lancet drones, and as a result of significant number of attacks, the Ukrainians lost almost every single vehicle they had, and the infantry stretched between the buildings and probably established control over these houses and buildings, waiting for upcoming Russian counteroffensive. So based on these videos, we can make a conclusion that Ukraine Ukrainians entered the village. We see in this scene a personal carrier and Ukrainian infantry that landed somewhere in among the streets of this small village, and most likely the Ukrainians captured some buildings. So anyway, for now we're not changing the color of this area, but I believe that most likely tomorrow, the day after, we will change the map, because obviously according to this video the Ukrainians entered this territory. Yes, the Russians, as a result of counterattacks and counterfire, managed to destroy a significant number of vehicles, but we see the same pictures all over the line of combat contact. But when the Ukrainians were destroying the Russian vehicles, but it doesn't mean that the infantry and the soldiers were destroyed. Most likely the soldiers abandoned the vehicles and captured the buildings and were waiting for upcoming counterattacks from the Russian side. So as I understand, the village of this Cherkasska, this village is under complete, Cherkasskaya Porechna is under complete Ukraine control, or at least in contested area. Now let's talk about the Martinovka. If you remember, we were talking that during the previous 24 hours there were very heavy clashes in this area. The Ukrainians were trying to capture the southwestern part of the village. The Russians were bringing additional forces from Большое Soldatska with the purpose to establish complete control over the entire village. But according to information we have, most likely the Ukrainians managed to save their presence in the eastern part of the city, of the village. This part most likely is under complete Ukraine control, but the Russians published the video. This is the video, very short one, just 3 seconds, and the author of this video stated that in this video we can see the Russian soldiers who were clearing the buildings in the streets of Martinovka. These Russian soldiers were moving along this street. For now we are not going to change the map, we are going to keep as is, but most likely during the next few days some part of Martinovka will be changed in Ukrainian favor. Maybe not. Now let's move further. Let's talk about the southern direction. During the previous 24 hours we have additional updates about progress of armed forces of Ukraine from different mappers. According to information we have, the Ukrainians established complete control over the village by the name of Zamostye, and the Ukrainians established complete control over the village by the name of Makhnovka. Today some Ukrainian sources published the photo with the flag from Makhnovka itself, but that was a fake photo, and maybe some mappers adjusted their maps about the territory of Makhnovka based on the fake photos. So let's wait for additional updates, but there are very high chances that there are no Ukrainians exactly in this area. Now let's move to Guyeva, to Plekhovo direction. During the previous 24 hours, the main activity the Ukrainians shown exactly on this flank. The Ukrainians were trying to advance, were trying to capture additional territories, they were trying to break through the Russian defense belt and to conduct reconnaissance and combat. According to information we have, the Ukrainians managed to establish complete control over the village of Guyeva. The Ukrainians published the video with the flag exactly in this point, which confirms complete control over this territory. Furthermore, the sources are saying that Ukrainians crossed the river and were trying to attack the village of Plekhovo, but those attacks were repelled by the Russians, by the reinforcement, and currently the eastern side of Plekhovo is under complete Russian control, and most likely the western one is in the gray zone. During the previous days, the Ukrainians were bombing and attacking the Russian forces, and also we got a report from the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation that they were also attacking the Ukrainian forces in the vicinity of the village by the name of Borki, which means that most likely the Ukrainians also made an attempt to attack exactly in this area, trying to cut the supply between Plekhovo itself and Borki. So we do not know for sure what is the current status of this direction, but maybe the Ukrainians managed to achieve some results and some progress on the ground. The Russians published few videos. In this video we can see some unique and rare equipment, most likely something like electronic warfare equipment that was attacked and destroyed as a result of Russian Lancet strike. Now let's move back to the Ministry of Defense report. They also gave a statement regarding Ukraine attempts to break through the Russian defense belt and the Russian border on other directions. You know that yesterday at 11 p.m. of the local time, the Russian sources start spreading the information that Ukrainians tried to open another front line and that they managed to achieve significant results. Today the Ministry of Defense gave us additional updates about the situation, and according to the Ministry of Defense, the Ukrainians were attacking the village, were moving in the vicinity of the village village by the name of Ozerki. The Ukrainians were using significant number of personal carriers for these purposes, fast lightning attack. The Ukrainians were continuing moving further in the eastern direction, and the Russians are saying that they managed to stop the Ukrainians just in the vicinity of the area by the name of Ivanovsky. So just take a look at this road. Most likely this is the road of Ukraine attack, and if we try to calculate the distance without almost no resistance from the Russian side, the Ukrainians managed to bypass around 30 kilometers, and after 30 kilometers were passed by the Ukrainians, the convoy, the Ukrainian scout group was destroyed. And the Ukrainians were conducting this operation with one purpose: to understand the number of forces that the Russians have in this direction. And most likely the Ukrainians realized that this defense belt, this part of the border, is also empty as the Russian border in the vicinity of Sudzha. So very likely the Ukrainians would continue attempts to attack in this direction until the Russians are able to stabilize the situation. If the situation in this direction develops the same way as in the vicinity of Sudzha, that means that the Russians would be able to stop the Ukrainians maybe just on this line. So let's wait for additional updates, and this upcoming night is going to be decisive exactly for this road of attack. And of course the Russians are saying that they managed to stabilize the situation. I believe that lots of media also stated the same, that the situation is okay, the situation is under complete control. But today the Russian sources, not the Russians but the Ukrainian sources, published very interesting videos. This is the newly created trenches and the fortifications all over the entire Kursk region that the Ukrainians, that the Russians built since the beginning, have already created since the beginning of Kursk offensive operation. Most of these trenches were geolocated, of course, because the photos were made using the modern satellite services, and according to geolocations, the Russians currently are building the first defense belt in Kursk direction, and this is the area of the trenches and the fortifications that the Russians have already created. So of course all these trenches and the fortifications tell us that the Russians are not 100% sure that they are able to stabilize the situation in Sudzha. They are able, obviously, but the Russians are trying to say that the Ukrainians do still have some chances for these fast lightning breakthrough attacks that can lead to, let's say, to collapse of the front line on different directions. And the first, and some Ukrainian groups are able to get the main supply road between Lvov, Rylsk and Kursk. So there are still a lot of chances, very big chances, that there can be additional mass in this direction. Now let's move further. Let's talk about northern Kharkiv area. The Russians and the Ukrainians are saying that the Russians continue concentration of the force along the border, and that the Russians are planning to attack towards Zolochiv. During the previous 24 hours, the Russians attacked the cities and the villages in this direction, trying to destroy the temporary positions of armed forces of Ukraine. But the Ukrainians still don't know where exactly the Russians are concentrating their forces. So that's why during the previous few days, the Ukrainians were conducting reconnaissance and combat, trying to understand where is the Russian concentration of forces. Yesterday we were talking about Ukrainian control over Paros. Today we got report from different sources that Ukrainians were trying to attack the Russian forces in the village by the name of Bezemenna, but as for this village, the Russians are saying that attack was repelled. As for Paros, the attack wasn't repelled, the Ukrainians answered and then they abandoned their positions. As for Bezemenna, the attack was repelled, which confirms that most likely the Russians are trying to concentrate forces here, but not here. Now the Ukrainians, as I understand, have more or less reliable information regarding the future possible Russian attacks, and of course the Ukrainians also try to be prepared themselves before possible escalation in this direction. As for the city of Volchansk, during the previous 24 hours we haven't received anything, just additional report about small progress of the Russians inside of the citadel. Northern Kupiansk direction, during the previous 24 hours we have adjusted the map because we received significant number of geolocations and updates exactly from the area between Berestov and Novoselovka and Stelmachovka. First we got during this morning, during the previous update, we got the video the report of FPV drone of map adjustments by different mappers, and we have added additional territory like this one. This cloud was added to the area of contested area, and later during the day we got additional video from the 77th Air Mobile Brigade of Armored Forces of Ukraine of how they were FPV droning the Russian soldier exactly in this point, which confirms that the Russians were attacking this road and that the Russians managed probably to get as close as possible to Stelmakhovka itself, and probably even to, let's say, establish control over positions that located to the northeast of the village, so creating additional pressure on the city and creating additional encirclement of this area. Before this attack, the Russians conducted artillery preparation, trying to destroy the Ukrainian artillery forces further to the west, and after successful preparation, the Russians conducted that attack. So anyway, due to this geolocation, due to this configuration of the front line, we can make a conclusion that we can start counting days before Stelmakhovka falls. Now let's move to the south in Kupinsk direction. During the previous 24 hours, the Russian sources published significant number of videos of how they were bombing and attacking the area between Makiivka, Nevskaya, so the south in Kupinsk direction, the positions of armored forces of Ukraine that are located towards the city of Liman. So obviously the number of these geolocations confirms that the Russians do have some plans regarding this area, and maybe within the next few days the Russians will launch the full-scale offensive operation with the purpose to break the Ukrainian defense belt completely and to collapse the entire direction of armored forces of Ukraine. Now let's move further in the southern area to Siversk. During the previous 24 hours, we got just a few videos from this area. The Russians were bombing and attacking the Ukrainian forces, as you can see, and as a result of these attacks, the Ukrainians most likely lost additional warehouses and ammo depots, and the Russians are continuing preparation before further full-scale offensive towards Zvanovka and the city Kuzminovka and of course Pirezhne. But as you can see, the Ukrainians still have control over the railways. Now let's move further. Let's talk about Sataretsk-New York agglomeration. During the previous 24 hours, we got additional videos from this area summarizing everything. The Russians began bombing and attacking. The Russians began the artillery preparation of the main positions of the main stronghold. We are talking about the stronghold of Pivnichne in the vicinity of Pivnichne coal mine. The Russians were bombing with total and tower systems the southern positions of armored forces of Ukraine. Also, we got the video of how the Russians were bombing Terikon itself, trying to suppress Ukrainian anti-tank position, Ukrainian communication positions, and so on. So the landfill is about to be stormed by the Russians from many directions. I'll remind you that, and of course the video of FPV drone attack, which is also very important, that confirms that the Russians control the road supply roads that goes from the mainland, from Toretsk itself towards the village as well. So this is very important videos, because now we see that the Russians are planning to begin assault of the Terikon from the south. The Russians are planning to do the same from the east, and most likely the Russians are about to begin doing this from the north and from the northeast. I'm not sure that the Russians are able to capture the Terikon so fast, but obviously it's this thing that they need to do, because if Terikon falls, if the landfill of Pivnichne falls, then the Russians will have no resistance, almost no resistance, to move further in Toretsk, and nobody knows whether the Ukrainians are able and ready to meet the Russians in this citadel, because if Toretsk falls, then the battle for Donbas arc operation will begin. So let's wait for additional updates. Anyway, the situation is getting worse and worse for the Ukrainians. Now let's move to Pokrovsk area. We have additional updates. The most important from the death road that Ukrainians still continue using for supplying and supporting their forces. First, let's talk about Ivanovka. Today, according to different mappers, the Ukrainians abandoned Ivanovka, their positions in Ivanovka completely, and the Russians secured the territory. Most likely tomorrow, the day after, the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation will provide us additional updates, because now, because of the situation in Kursk, it's very important to show people, to publish additional information about additional gains, like to improve the spirit of Russian army. So that's why I believe that they will not wait until the, let's say, finals, the last secure of the area. They will do this as fast as possible. We had a very interesting video from Grodovka. The video was published by the Russian sources. In this video, we can see how Ukrainian tank was entering the southeastern part of Grodovka, and how the Ukrainian tank was attacking the edge positions of armored forces of Ukraine. So the Russians were very surprised when they saw this video, but later they made a conclusion that due to electronic warfare, due to different equipment that the Russians are using to suppress connection and communication between the forces of armored forces of Ukraine, basically they lost the understanding. The Russians made the the mass, and the Ukrainian tank entered this area and from this distance was attacking the edge Ukraine positions, making a big favor to armed forces of Russia. Anyway, this video confirms that the battle for Grodovka is already ongoing. We see that the building are already damaged and that there are a lot of ruins already, so the clashes are very heavy and the Russians are moving further. Now let's move to the death road. As you can see, we got additional geolocations from the area between Grodovka, Novogrodovka, Orlovka, Novozhelanne. The Russians published additional batch of videos of how they were hunting and destroying everything that were using this road for supply, support, evacuation. As a result, as you can see, the Russian drone was flying above the already destroyed Abrams tank. This is Abrams tanks. It was destroyed during the previous attacks, and the Russians attacked additional vehicle. A little bit further, we have another video. Another vehicle was running the same road, trying to evacuate maybe Ukrainian soldiers, but also was attacked by the Russian FPV drone. And later, the vehicle was damaged and lost its movement, and then the Russians destroyed. In this video, we can see another attack by the armed forces of Russian Federation. Another vehicle was damaged and destroyed. This is Bradley. In this same area, we have another video of how Ukrainians were trying to redeploy force from one side to another, but the Russians discovered the movement of armed forces of Ukraine and destroyed. And you know, this is very important video, this living road or death road and the situation in Grodovka. Basically, when Ukrainians were attacking their own positions, they were 100% sure that these positions were already captured by the Russians. And the Ukrainians made this conclusion based due to problems, significant problems with the communication, because the Russians managed to suppress everything and to destroy the communication along the line of combat contact. And as I understand, the Ukrainians who were entering this death road also doesn't have information about the status of this road, and when they enter this territory, they 100% sure that nothing is going to happen to them. But we see the number of vehicles that the Russians are destroying. If we increase the numbers of this since the beginning of just August for 11 days, the Ukrainians lost a few dozens of vehicles just in this direction, including tanks like Abrams tanks, significant number of Bradleys, and we are not counting like vehicles that also were destroyed by the Russians. So the Ukrainians continue suffering losses, and most likely due to this situation, this artillery pocket, this we can call it not artillery but this FPV drone pocket, would be captured by the Russians as soon as the Russians decide to do this. For now, everything is okay because they see that the Ukrainians continue sending forces, and for the Russians it's better to continue destroying vehicles than to move further and let's say and to face these vehicles in close combat somewhere in Novogrodovka and Sridova. For now, it's better to destroy as many as possible, and then the Russians will continue. South Donetsk direction, there is a small operational pause. During the previous 24 hours, we haven't received anything regarding additional updates. On the ground, the only thing we have is that the Russians managed to capture additional additional tree line towards Vadiana. So the territory was captured according to geolocation that was published by the Ukrainians. Prichistovka area, the Russians continue pummeling and attacking the Ukrainian forces all over the entire village in the south, and the trenches fortifications along the village itself. Everything tell us that the Russians are about to begin a full-scale offensive exactly through the village, but the Russians have been bombing these areas since probably the May or April of 2024, but yet without any attempt to make real steps in this direction. As for Kherson direction, nothing special. The Ukrainians, after failed attempts to attack Tendra and Kinburn Spit, after significant number of videos of the results, reading quotes of Ukrainian attacks, they decided to change everything because the pictures that the Russians were seeing with significant number of Ukrainian soldiers who left there forever was terrible, obviously, and of course it's not a very good idea to continue developing this situation. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.